Welcome to another episode of God's Glory in His Story. I'm your host, MC Enemy. That's INAME. Because it's not about me, it is about the Word of God and His truth on this channel. Don't forget the prayer of Paul to the Ephesians, Ephesians chapter 3, 16 through 21. Read it, it will bless you with the understanding of God's word and his love. Don't forget the Cap for Christ at 12:34 a.m. and p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 2 Chronicles 7:14. Go read it. It will bless you. I just want to take the time to say to all my Israelites out there, Happy New Year. I know some of you guys look at me like you're crazy. Like, what is he talking about? Well, Rosh Hashanah just passed, and that is the Jewish New Year. And it says here, and it tells you, it's in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 23 through 31, talks about it. And it says, while some ancient cultures, such as the Celts or Celts, celebrated the start of the new year during the spring equinox because it was a time of planting, Semitic cultures, which is what we are, in the Near East celebrated the new year in the fall after the harvest was gathered. The name of Rosh Hashanah can be translated as first or head of the year. Our ancient Israelites, brothers and sisters, called it the Feast of Trumpets. Why do you think we have all of our crop over celebrations in the fall? Think about it. I'm just saying. So our 400th year has ended because the new year just took place, right? The new year started to end on September 18th at sundown, and it lasted until September 20th at sundown. So we are now in the new year. The 400th year has ended. We have completed that sentence. So now our spiritual blindness or blinders should be lifted. But my question to you is, how did the Lord mark this occasion? Now, please take what I'm about to say in context, because we don't know somebody's prayer life. But on September 18th, the Lord transitioned the highest profile Jewish person in the land, the notorious RGB. May she rest in peace. But now, look at what's happening. Babylon is about to lose its mind. You guys remember that song, The Freaks Come Out at Night? Well, you can change that freak into hypocrites. The hypocrites come out at night. The hypocrites come out at night. Hip, hip, hip. Let's see what happens. All right, New Living Translation, Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 9. And it reads, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, repairing cities destroyed long ago. They will revive them, though they have been deserted for many generations. Foreigners will be your servants. They will feed your flocks and plow your fields and tend your vineyards. You will be called priests of the Lord, ministers of our God. You will feed on the treasures of the nations and boast in their riches. Instead of shame and dishonor, you will enjoy a double portion, a double share of honor. You will possess a double portion of prosperity in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully reward my people for their suffering and make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants will be recognized and honored among the nations. Everyone will realize that they are a blessed people, a people the Lord has blessed. All right, so today's episode is entitled West Coast, East Coast beef. And you guys know me, it's a play on words. So let's see where I'm going with this. Before Tupac and Biggie got into it, before the East Coast hated the West Coast, 500 years prior, the West Coast of Africa dominated the slave trade. In order to get in on the action, traders had to get creative. And the little known East African slave trade was born. Yes, brothers and sisters, we're going to talk about the East African slave trade today. And most people know about the West African slave trade, but they don't know about the East African slave trade. It is well documented there was a West African slave trade, but did you know there was also an East African slave trade going on as well? And at the same time, why is it so important that you know who you are? Here it is in one verse. This is the King James Bible with the Apocrypha, or the 1611 King James Bible. This is Luke chapter 10, verse 16. Just one verse. It's in red because Christ is speaking. And I'm going to preface this by saying he's speaking to the disciples. These are the additional disciples that he made, not just the apostles, the 12, but he made 70 others, and he was about to send them out to preach his word. And here's what he said. He that heareth you, heareth me. And he that despiseth you, despiseth me. And he that despiseth me, despiseth him that sent me. Now, his disciples, his apostles, his prophets were all Israelites. He gave his word to the Israelites. And in the Old Testament days, They spoke Hebrew. So if he's talking about you and I or anyone who's grafted into Israel, said, he that despiseth you despiseth me. And if they despise him, they despise the one that sent him. That's a powerful word right there in one sentence. So let's find out or further prove who you are. So I'm going to read some excerpts from various articles. Zanzibar is the semi-autonomous part of Tanzania in East Africa. It is composed of the Zanzibar archipelago in the Indian Ocean off the coast of the mainland and consists of numerous small islands and 2 large ones. The capital is Zanzibar City, located on the Isle of Unguja. And its historic center is Stone Town, which is a World Heritage Site. So here is a picture of Tanzania off the east coast of Africa, and you can see in the yellow are the islands of Zanzibar. Just to put it in perspective, I'll give you a bigger map later on so you can see it a little bit better. And here it is. So that green area is the coast, the east coast of Africa, and just off that east coast area is the islands of Tanzania. Toward the 18th and 19th centuries, the flow of Zanju or Bantu, remember I told you, Bantu is really 2 words, is Abba into. So the flow of the father's people, slaves from East Africa, increased with the rise of Oman Sultanate, which was based in Zanzibar. They came into direct trade conflict and competition with Portuguese and other Europeans along the Swahili coast. The North African Barbary states carried on piracy against European shipping and enslaved thousands of European Christians. They earned revenues from the ransom charged. And in many cases, Britain, village churches, and communities would raise money for such ransoms. The government did not ransom its citizens. Same thing happens today. We still see the same thing off of that coast, piracy. The Bible tells us at Ecclesiastes 1:9, there's nothing new under the sun. Let's move on. Scope of the trade. Historians estimate that between 650 and 1900 AD, 10 to 18 million peoples were enslaved by Arab slave traders and taken from Africa across the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Sahara Desert. The term Arab used in historical documents often represented an ethnic term, as many of the Arab slave traders, such as Tipu Tip and others, were physically indistinguishable from the Africans whom they enslaved and sold. Due to the nature of the Arab slave trade, it's impossible to be precise about actual numbers. Parts of the area that is today considered Swahili Coast was known as Azania or Zengian in the Greco-Roman era, and as Zanji or Zinji in the Middle Eastern and Chinese literature. Remember, that means Bantu. From the 7th to the 14th century. That's right there around the time that the Moors were in control of Europe, Western Europe. The rise of the Swahili coast city-states can be attributed to the region's extensive participation in a trade network that spanned the Indian Ocean. So here you can see the Indian Ocean African slave trade, some of the various routes that they established. This is between 1500 and 1900, which is the same time frame as the transatlantic slave trade was going on. And if you look at these arrows, you can see they have numbers associated with many of them to give you an idea of how many thousands of slaves were brought to the various portions of the Middle and Eastern world. So the story of East Africa's role in the transatlantic slave trade. This article is from June 17th of 2015. And again, I'm just taking excerpts out of it. And I do hope to have some links in the description box afterwards for you to read in its entirety at your leisure. East Africa was a late participant in the transatlantic slave trade. It was only in the 1770s that a regular trade in slaves to the French islands of Mauritius and Reunion began from points on the East African coast. Small numbers of slaves had been carried around the Cape for more than a century, but as planters on Saint Domingue, that's Haiti before it became Haiti, cried out for labor, this trade became more profitable and systematic, particularly as the French king agreed to subsidize the shipment of slaves to the island. West Central Africa bore the brunt of this demand, but as the price of slaves rose, traders looked further afield for their human merchandise. So although it took around 120 days to get from Mozambique to Saint Domingue, that's Tanzania to Haiti, and almost 30% of the slaves died on this long middle passage, it's still, and I put the word still in there, quickly became a profitable route. So here is a map of the many slave trade areas. So if you look at the one that's going down on the right of the screen, you can see that's the Tanzania going around the Cape or the Horn of Africa and entering into the trade routes, competing with the many that are coming from West Africa. Then you have some that have been in red there that are taken across land into other places of the world. So all the people that they were gathering seemed to come from the interior areas of Africa. Who's in the interior areas of West and Central Africa? Bantu-speaking people, or as we know now, the Abantu-speaking people, people who spoke the language of the Father, Hebrew. "140 million victims of the Islamic slave trade. However, at least 28 million Africans were enslaved by the Muslims, as at least 80% of those captured by the Muslim slave traders were calculated to have died before reaching the slave markets. Wow. That's a lot of people to lose. Hebrew communities before the slave trade. Article written in January 19, 2015. It reads, the Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade took place across the Atlantic Ocean from the 16th through the 19th centuries. The vast majority of slaves were transported to the New World, according to written history, were not native Africans from central and western and eastern parts of the continent. In fact, these people have been historically proven to be descendants of early Hebrews. It says it's proven to be descendants of early Hebrews that had migrated from Arabia and Egypt and Ethiopia into West Africa. These people were attacked and sold by native African tribes and Muslims to European slave traders, who then transported them to the North and South and Central Americas. So I'm about to show you guys a map of Africa before European colonization. So you can, take a screenshot of this, open it up, because there's a wealth of information in the fine print here. But you just can't see it on this screen. So if you're interested, you take the time to go and read some of the captions, and I'm sure it will edify you. So this is going to be one of the links that I plan to put in the description box. So be on the look for that after the video. Another article goes on to say, as early as 63 BC, under Pompey's campaign, many of the dispersed Hebrews were enslaved in Rome. In 70 AD, that's when the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem at the hands of Titus, a Roman general, under the reign of Titus Vespasian, there was a 4-year onslaught against Hebrew Israel, and many were either killed or sold into slavery. The last Hebrew revolt against Rome occurred in 135 AD. After 135 AD, the entire Hebrew nationhood was dispersed, scattered. A multitude of Hebrews fled from Rome for fear of persecution through either death or enslavement. So just as the Bible said, Judah will be scattered, dispersed among the 4 quarters of the earth. Remember, Israel was already gone at that time. The great transmigration of Hebrew Israel. The Hebrews migrated into Arabia immediately after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD. During this period, the Hebrews referred to themselves as Yemenite Hebrews. It is said that the Yemenite Hebrews came out of the line of Solomon and Queen of Sheba and their son Menelik. Also, they are closely related to the Ethiopians of Abyssinia. The Arabs were one of the first peoples to identify the great landmass of Kush in Africa, and it was called Bilal es Sudan. Cyprus had a very large population of Hebrews. Many of them were disciples of the Nazarene doctrine, and some held trades as coppersmiths during the period of 135 AD. By the 2nd century, Great masses of Hebrews had migrated into Alexandria, Egypt, and all across the northern coast of Africa, including Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Mauritania. By the 5th and 6th centuries, they fled from the Byzantine, the Roman occupied countries, into the region of the Sahara Desert and the Sudan. Many of the Hebrews played a significant role in cultivating the Great Sahara Desert. Across Africa and into Spain, in the middle of the 7th century, the Arabs were on the move and launched an attack against Egypt and won. They continued to move across Africa and into Spain, Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. Had been under the rule of the Moors for well over 500 years. As early as the 6th century, there was a great population of Hebrews. Many of them were devout men who dominated most of the learning centers, religious and secular, throughout Spain. They were once again persecuted for the practice of their faith, and many were forced to convert to Islam or flee. It wasn't until the great Inquisitions of Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1496 that Hebrew Israel migrated in great numbers to the Mediterranean coasts and northern and western Africa. Those that did not flee were sold into slavery. Now, I put this in red, not because this is Jesus speaking, but I put it in red because this is very important information. It's documenting the migration patterns. So it reads, many Hebrews migrated to Asia Minor, which is Turkey, as a means of escaping the persecution of Spain and Portugal during the period of 1547 AD. Finally, the vast majority of Hebrews migrated into Western Africa, Sudan. Remember, Sudan was a lot larger than what it is today, different borders. And remember, and Sudan means, it's really So-Udan, 2 words, meaning sojourners or travelers or foreigners, that's the word, foreigners of Judah. So vast majority of Hebrews migrated into Western Africa, Sudan, along the western coast of Africa, and sojourned there for over 1,500 years. So between 70 AD and 1619 AD. That 1619 AD should sound familiar also, because that's when the first one of us landed in the colonies that were to become the United States. The Hebrews became a dominant factor in establishing many of the cultures throughout Western Africa, including the following countries. In Ghana, the Hebrews were identified as the Ashanti. In Mali, the indigenous people were identified as the Mandinka. However, they were not Hebrews. I question that, but I'm just reading what it said in the articles. And remember, these are excerpts from articles. In Songhai, the city of Timbuktu was a great center of education and commerce, and many of the indigenous people were Hebrews. Guinea, which was known as the Gold Coast, also had a significant number of Hebrews. And that's the southern portion of Western Africa. West Central Africa, I should say, specify that. During the middle of the 15th century, Europe had entered the slave trade. This was the period of the decline of the great Sudanese empires, which brought on the struggle with Arab invaders and tribal wars. The introduction of gunpowder by the Europeans exasperated. It made worse the decline of so many of the warring factions. Now, human life and gold were traded for gunpowder and arms. Under King Charles V and the Catholic papacy, the Pope, the treasured and highly prized papal bull, that's a order from the Pope, called Asiento, and it's a license to enslave Africans, was first issued to the Portuguese. As early as 1441, Prince Henry the Navigator had entered Africa, and by 1481, Portugal had established the first European outpost, Fort Elmina in Ghana, near the city of Benin. During this period, the Portuguese coined the phrase Negro, meaning black. In the early 17th century, 1619, the first 20 Africans arrived in Virginia as slave laborers for the harvesting of tobacco, and the rest is history. According to most accounts, the earliest Jewish settlements in Africa were in places such as Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. Jews had settled among the Upper Nile at Elephantine in Egypt. These communities were augmented by subsequent arrivals of Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, when 30,000 Jewish slaves were settled throughout Carthage, which is northern Africa, by the Roman Emperor Titus. Africa is identified in various Jewish sources in connection with Tarshish and Ophir. The Septuagint and Jerome, who was taught by Jews, and very often the Aramaic Targum on the prophets, identified the biblical Tarshish with Carthage, which was the birthplace of a number of rabbis mentioned in the Talmud. Africa, in a broader sense, is clearly indicated where mention is made of the 10 tribes having been driven into exile by the Assyrians and having journeyed into Africa. Connected with this is the idea that the river Sebastian is in Africa. So here's something you can do some homework. Just Google the Sebastian River in Africa and see where it is. The Arabs, who also know the legend of Beni Musa, which is the sons of Moses, agree with the Jews in placing their land in Africa. It is also stated that they had an army of 1,500 men. Other sources say that the other Jewish communities in the region were formed by migrations from Morocco, Egypt, and Portugal. When a Scottish explorer, Mungo Park, traveled through West Africa in the late 18th century, he was informed by an Arab he met near Walata of there being many Arabic-speaking Jews in Timbuktu, whose prayers were similar to the Moors. Some communities were said to have been populated by certain Berber Jews, like a group of Kal Tamashek, known as Idao Ishak, that traveled from North Africa into West Africa for trade, as well as those escaping the Islamic invasions into North Africa. In the 14th century, many Moors and Jews fleeing the persecution of Spain migrated south to the Timbuktu area, at that time part of the Songhai Empire. Among them was the Kehath or Kati family, who descended from Ismael, John Kot al-Yahudi of Shida. Yahudi is a term meaning Yahudim, God's people. Sons of this prominent family found 3 villages that still exist near Timbuktu: Kershamba, Hayambo, and Kongorara. In 1492, Askia Muhammad I came to power in the previously tolerant region of Timbuktu and decreed that Jews must convert to Islam or leave. Sound familiar? 1492? So not only was the Europeans saying you can't be Jews anymore, the Islamic leaders were saying you can't be Jews anymore. If you want to be a Jew, you got to leave. So Judaism became illegal in Mali, as it did in Catholic Spain that same year. Why do you think only certain people were taken? Read that Psalms 83 again. It tells you that the nations were going to conspire against us. And that is exactly what happened. Here is a gentleman, his name is Olaudah Equiano, and he wrote his autobiography. And he was a Hebrew that got taken in the slave trade. And he became a very large abolitionist in the States. 1789. So that was when his autobiography was to come out, I believe. So take a look at that if you're interested. If you're a reader, it would be very interesting to get a firsthand account of his treatment and how many times he was traded and sold and moved. New Living Translation, Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 24 through 26. And it reads, "Have you noticed what people are saying? The Lord chose Judah and Israel and then abandoned them. They are sneering and saying that Israel is not worthy to be counted as a nation. But this is what the Lord says: I would no more reject my people than I would change my laws that govern day and night, earth and sky. I will never abandon the descendants of Jacob or David, my servant, or change the plans that David's descendants will rule the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Instead, I will restore them to their land and have mercy on them." All right, I got through this. I was trying to make sure I get through it because there was a lot of information there, but you can play it back. You can, pause it. You can open up some of the screen, take screenshots, open up some of the maps that I showed you. So hopefully this episode has been edifying to you to know that there was an East African slave trade as well as the West African slave trade. And all were pulling from the same group of people. All right, brothers and sisters, I thank you for watching. And as always, worship the Father, praise the Son, and accept the Holy Spirit. Y'all be blessed. I'm out. Peace.